I'm really pleased to be speaking at this conference in this really amazing venue and in honor of Law Day. The Virginia Law Foundation and the Holocaust Museum clearly have an impressive record of convening a distinguished community to talk about really important issues. And I'm just glad that I was able to join you for this year's event. Last December, at a rally held in front of the federal court building in Manhattan, several people in the crowd called for violence against our nation's Attorney General, Eric Holder. Rally participants were protesting the Obama administration's decision to try 9/11 suspects on US soil and to close Guantanamo Bay. The video from the rally, which is posted on YouTube, sparked fear in me. As was just mentioned, I survived an al-Qaeda bombing and have written and spoken politically about my personal opposition to holding detainees in Guantanamo Bay and my endorsement of civilian court trials for terror suspects. My belief in our nation's ability to use civilian courts comes from my participation in a successful trial in New York City of 4 al-Qaeda operatives ultimately convicted of bombing 2 US embassies in East Africa. I wrote a book about my experiences, and although this is that's a conversation for another time, I mention it to explain why the threats expressed at the rally frightened me personally and caused me to worry for Eric Holder's well-being and for the safety of anyone who seeks to speak out about the controversial issues of our times. I watched the YouTube video as a survivor, but also as a cultural and legal anthropologist who teaches about conflict. I have the great privilege of teaching in the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. It's a center for excellence in the Virginia higher education system. I noted that those who threatened Eric Holder with violence for his role in these decisions deployed classic racist hate speech when they called for him to be lynched. That powerful term invokes a history of racial exploitation and violence that makes it particularly threatening for African Americans and offensive to any of us who fight and teach against racism. The dynamics, rhetoric, and symbolism of the New York rally was not unique. Over the past few years, provocative speech about political and social issues has been expressed by civic leaders, politicians, media pundits, and ordinary people. Speech that conveys hate, causes hurt, and threatens violence is increasingly part of public discourse, especially through new media such as blogs or web videos. Inflammatory and divisive utterances in writing can make it very difficult to engage in productive discussion. This is especially true for deliberations over complex issues about which people hold legitimate differences of opinion. For instance, the question of how to deal with terror suspects deserves and requires reasoned discussion among persons who feel shielded from attack. What concerns me most about public discourse is that we're losing our ability to deliberate complex issues from multiple perspectives. That kind of discussion, though difficult, is a cornerstone of democracy. The climate for speech of the current moment, where asserting one's viewpoint is all too often accompanied by ignoring, ridiculing, or advocating destruction of anyone who disagrees, doesn't leave much room for more nuanced deliberations and doesn't convey the value of such speech. My goal today is to first identify several types of speech that pose a problem for productive discussion, whether through expressing hate or threats or otherwise compromising the climate for conversation. I'll then zero in on 2 forms of speech that raise red flags for conflict specialists, because we know that when this speech is present, physical violence can easily follow. If my suspicions are true that these dangerous forms of speech are on the rise, and we're concerned to avert violence, the question arises, what should be done? My colleagues will offer important insight into the role of law in addressing this and related questions. My interest is to focus attention on a parallel approach that supports and supplements law, our shared norms for speech. Alongside legal rules are more flexible understandings about appropriate communication. My grandmother used to offer one of these to limit us from complaining about other people. She'd say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. We all express and live by formal and informal norms, and those vary across contexts. My grandmother's approach is certainly too constraining as a norm for our public discourse. But the idea that we can shape the climate for speech through norms provides an avenue for addressing our concerns about speech today. If we are dissatisfied or alarmed by tendencies in today's political speech, we as members of society can articulate and promote new norms. Toward the end of my talk, I will offer 3 examples of people and groups whose work promotes new norms for speaking that are intended to facilitate productive public discourse. Focusing on norms for speech as well as laws will help us to design and navigate a constitutionally informed way to engage in the hard conversations needed in a complex democracy. I'll argue that we should think as much about the norms for public discourse as we do about the laws that we might use when those norms break down. Hate speech, fright speech, fear speech, these are among the labels for words that cause harm, hurt, and intimidation. Let me identify a couple elements of this speech, although the categories overlap and they don't fit easily on any continuum. Insulting speech. We all know the usual insults used to humiliate or denigrate a person. Children and adults call each other stupid or dishonest or petty. Insults can change over time in their degree of offensiveness, depending on the context or the ideas of the day. Rahm Emanuel was criticized for his use of what's come to be known as the R word, a term felt as an epithet by the mentally disabled and by their supporters. Insults centered on clothing and sexual behavior, including orientation, are at the center of contemporary bullying, including cyberbullying, that has sadly led some young people to do violence to themselves and others. Insults include what's referred to in linguistic terms as metonymy, whereby the part stands for the whole, and these are used to reduce an individual man or woman or child to a body part. Another kind of hurt speech, dehumanizing speech. This is a powerful form of insult that entails calling someone an animal or a non-human object or creature. Dehumanizing discourse can indicate a very serious rupture, whereby some people refuse to recognize others as human. In places outside the US, people have been called cockroaches or rats or weeds, and probably in the US too. And often these are the kinds of things uttered just before they are attacked. Recent US examples include people being called robots or astroturf or disparaging takeoffs on political party titles. Senator Barney Frank was taken to task for saying the following to a woman at one of last summer's healthcare forums, quote, "Trying to have a conversation with you would be like trying to argue with a dining table. I have no interest in doing it," end quote. Frank explained afterwards that he had spoken out of incredible frustration after seeing the woman's poster on which President Obama was depicted as Adolf Hitler. That kind of expression is an example of my next category, de-individuating speech. This is speech that addresses people not as individuals, but only as members of a group or category. Moreover, those labeled are depicted as if they bear all the characteristics of that group. Think about the pervasive discourse lumping all Republicans or all Democrats, all conservatives, or all liberals. Some people might consider the label a badge of honor, but not when it's linked to speech intended to offend. Comments like, "What do you expect? She's a woman," refuse individuals the possibility of acting outside a categorical stereotype. Of course, groups have reclaimed offensive names to express pride, make a joke, or promote group solidarity. But most people reject the de-individuating feeling of being labeled without consent or incorrectly. So the application of communist or demagogue can be profoundly disconcerting to an individual who thought he or she was expressing an idea, not an ideology. Certainly, we reject being de-individuated through any category that entails extremely negative images. People across the political spectrum recently have been called Nazis. Despite its overuse, from Jerry Seinfeld's Soup Nazi to posters at political rallies, it remains a powerful epithet. In the 1990s, several law professors argued that these three types of speech constitute words that wound, or assaultive speech. Although we might not share their belief that those who use the worst of these words should be subject to tort action, it is hard to deny that the people targeted through such speech experience emotional pain. Psychological studies and individual stories establish that being confronted with this kind of language under certain circumstances can make people fearful, angry, withdrawn, less productive. To the extent that a person feels threat as well as insulted and stereotyped, they can become less confident about participating in public discourse. Some react to the feeling of harm by lashing out at others. Division and distrust within and between communities can result when such language is common. Some examples of hateful speech have a long history of being applied to particular oppressed, marginalized, or victimized groups, and so their use, depending on the context, can feel even more like a violation. The N-word, the F-word, and other choice racial, ethnic, religious, gender, and sexual stereotypes offend, hurt, and cause fear, in part because they're a reminder of generalized and specific violence in the past and present. We must look to the intention of the speaker, the relation between the parties, and to various features of the context to determine whether a particular utterance is worthy of condemnation or regulation. Can we always identify the speech that causes the most harm or poses the most danger? This subjective project is not an easy one. From the perspective of the conflict analysis field, where the goal is to avoid violent conflict, we look for particular types of speech that, for us, raise red flags.